Hi, everyone. Hi, Muna. Welcome to week 3. Is it week 3? Week 4? Week 4 already of Freedom is the Future. Where we hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from last sessions. Last session was very deep in the history, very historical analysis of kind of just in general Palestine, but really took us up to 1967 and focused on some of those myths that Zionists use for how, why they have ownership and superiority of the land, and how they've erased Palestinian history and existence of that land to justify their existence right now. So I want to do a couple of things before we get started. I just wanted to do quick housekeeping, see how everyone's feeling, doing. We'll do a little bit more of this next week, since that will be our midweek. Midway through the course, it'd be week 5, but we do have a guest speaker next week, and I think she wants a good amount of time. So I figured we could just talk now. Any suggestions, comments, things ways we can improve, if there's anything that stands out to anyone. Or you could just put them in the chat too, so we don't take too much time, or you can just privately message me or Danya, but I just want to put it out there. If there's any feedback or comments or things that we could do more of, that you would like more of, please let us know. And obviously you could let us know next week too. And then I also wanted to name that there was a lot that happened this weekend in Palestine specifically, and then also in this country with the killing of Tyre Nichols. So just, all of it is really under the theme of state-sanctioned violence and violence from military entities and state entities onto people of color. And so I think that actually it's not a good thing, but it kind of ties in a lot of the solidarity movements between a lot of communities of color too, that we will get to second to last week of class. But I want to make room to talk about, because today what we're doing is we're going from the history to the present. So how does what happened in 67 inform what's going on right now? And I'm just going to take us more quickly through just time periods that are important. And then I figured we'd have a longer discussion at the end to tie in what happened this weekend too. But I wanted to just make some space for just informal, doesn't have to be tied to the history or the struggle, just feelings or reflections, or if people just wanted a space to talk about how frustrated and angry they are. I just want to open that up real quick if anyone needs it. Yeah, don't go ahead.
I was looking for the raise hand function, but I think also something that I've noted is, and we've been discussing this, is kind of the burnout that comes with all of this, and it's kind of recognizing it and being kind of figuring out a way to be kind of a couple steps ahead of it. Sometimes it feels especially when you're going against bigger systems of violence, or specifically there's an occupation that a lot of people tend not to see or vote, or see the other side of. You feel sometimes you're in an ocean with waves, and it's you just keep swimming, but there's no end in sight. So kind of recentering ourselves and realizing that, also being on this activist / advocate side, it's exhausting, and it's and that kind of just recognizing that emotion and placing that emotion and thinking, this is hopefully what will end up resulting in a free Palestine and free liberation for all oppressed people. So just kind of putting that out there, because if you're feeling that way, that's also okay to feel that way.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. Yeah, and if we don't want to talk about it at all, it's fine too. But I realize that sometimes we have people in community that we can talk to in these moments, and not everyone does. So I want to see if anyone else wants to. Or maybe we can just think about it as we continue, and as we get to the end portion of class. Actually, Danya, your dad sent an interview. I don't know if he sent you the interview with Diana Boutou that she just did. And I watched it right before this, and I think it might be helpful to watch towards the end. So hopefully we have time. Ooh, that's not the screen to share, unless you guys want to read. Why does it keep doing it? Can you all see, is it showing the slides? Okay, cool. So today's agenda, just, we did it, but a check-in and recap of last week. Today we're gonna do Palestine's history into the present, and then I want you all to keep these 5 myths in mind. Again, the readings are not required, but it is, if you have time, I think it's a good book to just really understand, like, what are the myths and the lies that Israel has been putting out since its inception, to allow it to exist and to get support from most of the world. Although we could say that in the last couple of years that public opinion has been shifting, but main powers still obviously support it. So some of what we're going to talk about will be covered. So the June 67 war was a war of no choice, so that, like, Israel had no choice but to engage in it. Because what they claim is that they were the ones getting attacked by Arab countries, but we're going to go over that. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. We can critique what does it mean to be a democracy, and how can you be democratic when you oppress and occupy other people. The Oslo Accords, which we'll also go over. The Gaza mythologies, that's a little bit deeper. We don't have as much time to focus on Gaza, but very, we'll watch a couple of videos about that and some of the resistance that people in Gaza have shown. And then the two-state solution being the only way forward, and some critiques of two-state solution and what are the differences. We're not going to get, I want to have as much time for the end to get into deep discussion, but just if we don't get to it all and you all really want to focus on some of these, just let us know, and we'll make sure that some of our guest speakers that are coming touch on these too. Okay, and then we went over our caterpillar of freedom. So I want to recenter, because last week Jihad did a great job in giving us the history from a Palestinian context. I think, very specifically what happened. I want us to, as we're thinking about the history and what Jihad really modeled for us, is centering Palestinians when talking about Palestinian history. And, these aren't just moments and events in time. These are events in time that, as for the Nakba specifically, did not end and continues and have real effects and consequences on people and their families. So every year, Palestinians commemorate the Nakba on May 15th, commemorate it as loss, as a catastrophe, but also as a reminder of Palestinian resilience, and that even though and despite all of that, 75 years later, Palestinians are still here, and we're still having classes talking about Palestine. And I've been doing a lot of reading for some other classes about, like, Indigenous struggle in this country. And I think part of the biggest takeaway I've taken is that we can't, as tiring and exhausting as it can be, we can't stop talking about it, because it just gets completely forgotten if we do. And so I want to make sure that we take some time, especially this year is the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, to take some time to understand the human element behind the Nakba and what it means to Palestinians. Sorry, actually, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare with my sound being better.
What people have to remember is this is in living memory. It's so deeply personal for people. Nakba, or al-Nakba, that in Arabic actually means the catastrophe. And the reason that it's referred to as a catastrophe is that about 80% of Palestinians who were living inside what became the borders of the state of Israel, what is now talked about inside the Green Line, were expelled from the country. That was about 750,000 Palestinians, maybe a little more. And around 500 or 600 villages were subsequently leveled. And they were leveled in such a way, and deliberately, so that Palestinians would not be able to return. I mean, think about it, 750,000 people about were forced out of their homes and never went back. I mean, who are it, right? Like, what does that mean, right? On a moment's notice, you're gone. That's it. You don't take anything with you. You take a bag, like what you can fit in a bag, because you had to walk, across the border to Lebanon if you were in the north, or to Jordan if you were in a different part, or Syria, right? People didn't think they were never going back. And, people lost everything, right? People who had homes and, businesses, they ended up refugees, like under the auspices of the UN. They lost everything, and people are still alive. And of course, we remember it because we grew up with their loss, right? It's much more of a street level grassroots movement. It's not a movement led by the political parties or militias, and it's spreading not just throughout the West Bank, but it's now spreading into Arab Palestinian cities and mixed, the term I can't stand, but that's what they're called, mixed Arab Jewish cities inside Israel, where that population itself is expressing extreme frustration as their citizenship, which has always been second class, comes to mean less and less and less. And I see here the possibility of what it means for young people to take to the streets again. This isn't like a day where something happens and then there's a bad day or two and it goes away. It has the feeling of something that has more possible longevity. It's very easy for Americans to always sit back and say, oh, it's not our war, right? It is our war. And I say this now as an American, it is our war because we're paying for a lot of it, right? This will not end until an actual political solution is reached, and one that is just. In other words, we can debate one-state solution, two-state solution, all you want. The one-state solution, two-state solution seems to be dead in the water. But whatever form the state takes, whether it's a single state or a federation of states, the issue is Palestinians have to have equal rights in the state.
Okay, so she, the grassroots movement she was talking about, that she saw like unity amongst Palestine, she's referring to 2022 Unity Intifada, which we're gonna cover in a little bit, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But something that I never knew before this video, I never knew about the Nakba law or proposed law or rule. And I think that kind of helped center what I started us off with, of like, the point is deliberate like erasure and just talking about this history and these historical events, or a whitewashing or diluted history of it, where Israel gets to control what the Nakba becomes. And that's, at least for me, is further motivation to keep talking about this and keep learning about these, and why sometimes it's like, okay, we get it, Palestinians went through that, right? Like there's that stereotype that a Palestinian is always going to let you know about what they went through, but that's the point. It's because that is something that Palestinians are deliberately fighting against every day. So I want to, and I know some people just joined, so I want to just explain again. I have a couple of videos. I want to take us through key historical moments, so then save more time for discussion after, just so we have time to really get through everything. But I don't want that to stop discussion. So please put comments in the chat, or just raise your hand, or just unmute, because it's hard for me to sometimes see the chat when I'm sharing my screen after each video, for any comments or reflections. So anyone have any comments or reflections, maybe one or two after each video before I move on? Okay, so again, this year is the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, and not just because it's a nice number that it matters, but PAC is going to be engaging in some projects to make sure that we honor the Nakba as much as we can. And so if any of you, I think most of you are affiliated to PAC, they're on this call right now, but if you want to be specifically involved in those, please let us know and we'll get you involved. We have some exciting stuff coming up. Okay. Wait, there's the next video. I think there's a slide missing. Did I ruin the?
No, I just reformatted it. This is it. This was the second slide after the first one.
Did I take away the slide that explained what the Nakba was? I mean, the Naksa was?
This was the second slide after that one. I didn't change the video.
I think that's weird. Okay. Well, in 1967, I think I might have messed that up. But in 1967, and if it does not make sense, I can go back, and it was a very short video about what the 1967 June War was, or is also called the 6-Day War.
You want me to find it? I think I know where it is.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
I feel like it makes sense, please. So the 67 war, and Jihad talked about 67 a little bit. We've talked about 67, but we haven't. I think we haven't explained in detail what happened, and I think the details of that war are important for that second myth that we saw on the slide, which was Israel had no choice but to engage in these wars, and they have to protect themselves from. At least historically, they had to protect themselves from Arab countries, and now they have to continue protecting themselves, and these myths of self-defense. A lot of them come from the way that they fabricated the stories of the 6-Day War and a lot of the resistance that happens today on the ground. So it is, to me, it's just as important as the Nakba to talk about what happened in 67, especially because, as you can tell from this slide, what happened in 67 does affect a lot of border conversations that we're seeing today, and especially what we saw happen in Sheikh Jarrah in 2021, and parts of East Jerusalem are very tied to what Palestinians lost in 1967. And so we will.
I found the video. It's the slide before I added it.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'll watch that, and then I will take us straight into, since you already saw it, the impact of this war on. Oh, this is the one that will show up.
No, this one should show up. Oh, they rechanged this one.
They do
No,
this.
there was another one that this wasn't the video that wasn't working before. This video was working before. Jeez Louise, they're blocking all these videos.
Which I always wonder, like, why 67 and not the Nakba, but that's another conversation. Sorry, guys. Hey, oh no. Bear with us.
So, oh, there you go. There's. Oh.
Not inappropriate, I promise. It's just, yeah.
الشعب العربي شعب واحد والجيش العربي جيش واحد ولن يفرق بيننا الاستعمار أو أعوان الاستعمار.
The 1967 Six-Day War is referred to by Arabs as the Naksa, the setback. It was a humiliating defeat for Arab powers and a major victory for Israel. It marked the beginning of 50 years of occupation of Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights in Syria, radically reshaping the destiny of the Middle East. On May 13, 1967, Soviet intelligence informed Egypt that Israeli forces were building up near the Syrian border. The following day, the symbol of Arab nationalism, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, ordered 130,000 Egyptian troops to move into the Sinai Peninsula along Israel's borders. The intent was to prevent an invasion of Syria, rather than to attack Israel. As tensions escalated on May 16th, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces from Sinai. 6 days later, the Egyptian president closed the Taran Straits, blocking ships from entering Israel's port of Eilat. Confident of their military superiority, Egyptian and Arabs celebrated Abdel Nasser's actions. What they didn't know was that Israel's army was better equipped and ready for war. In Israel, the media compared the Arabs to the Nazis, triggering memories of the Holocaust and fueling anti-Nasser sentiments. Fearing war, US President Lyndon Johnson warned both sides not to be the first to strike. The Egyptian-led Arab powers, fearing a US invasion, stood down. To their surprise, on June 5th at 7:45 a.m., the well-rehearsed Israeli aerial assault Operation Focus kicked off. By midday on June 5th, 200 Israeli jets had struck 18 Egyptian airfields, destroying more than 80% of the country's air force, before they even managed to get off the ground. However, Cairo made fake announcements claiming an Egyptian victory to rally its Arab neighbors to join the war effort. Syria, Jordan, and Iraq followed suit and started deploying their air forces to strike Israeli targets. But on the same day, Israel quickly destroyed all of their airfields as well, achieving complete air superiority. Despite not having any air support, the Egyptian soldiers held their defenses in Sinai against the Israeli incursion. Meanwhile, Jordan, under the leadership of King Hussein, had started a small offensive and had reached the hills overlooking southern Jerusalem. But by June 6th, Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir, having witnessed the might of Israel's air force, ordered the full retreat of Egypt's army from Sinai. Jordan, realizing the severity of Egypt's humiliating retreat, decided to pull back from its positions after minor clashes with the Israelis. By Wednesday, June 7th, Israel had successfully taken over the Jordanian-administered East Jerusalem and West Bank. By the fourth day of the war, Israel had reached the Suez Canal, with full control of the Egyptian-administered Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Having demolished the Jordanian and Egyptian armies, Syria was now on its own. On the fifth day of the war, Israel ascended the strategic Golan Heights. Syrian soldiers fought the Israeli forces. However, similar to their Egyptian allies, they were let down by the decisions of their leaders. Hafez al-Assad, then defense minister, accepted a UN ceasefire, undermining the ongoing military resistance. By the sixth day of the war, Israel accepted the UN ceasefire as well. But the damage had been done, and the Middle East would never be the same. Israel tripled in size. Arab armies and nationalism were crippled as a broken Egyptian president tried to resign in shame.
فإنني على استعداد لتحمل المسؤولية كلها ولقد اتخذت قراراً أريدكم جميعاً أن تساعدوني عليه. لقد قررت أن أتنحى تماماً ونهائياً عن أي منصب رسمي وأي دور سياسي وأن أعود إلى صفوف الجماهير وأدي واجبي معها كأي مواطن آخر.
Israel had proved its superiority and its army created a mythical aura, propelled by Arab leaders trying to hide their failures. Israel had gained administration of 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli settlements in the West Bank were built with more settlements in Egypt's Sinai and Syria's Golan Heights also under construction. Israel, taking advantage of Arab weakness, was not willing to give up its gains, using religious justification for their occupation of the lands. With its newfound power, Israel refused to comply with the international community. Palestinians had realized Arab powers could not protect them and went on to create their own national liberation movements that also failed to achieve their desired goal. Ultimately, the Six-Day War scarred the Arab psyche, paving the way for an overzealous Israeli leadership. And to this day, border issues remain unresolved.
So we're gonna get to what those specific border issues that they're referring to are. I think a couple other things to really highlight about 67, other than, well, obviously most importantly the extra land that was that became occupied. So the parts of the West Bank, Gaza, extra land that they took is really important because that's a lot of what's happening on the ground today is because of those borders and those border conflicts that he referred to. But I think I also want to mention one, like what they said in the end, the loss that it took on the Arab psyche and Arab nationalism, and we can debate Arab nationalism, what we mean by that, but at least thinking of it as solidarity and support from Arab countries. I know a lot of times internally we think of, how is no one doing anything? What about the rest of the Arab world? But a lot of that is one, because of these intense defeats that happened historically. And then Arab countries just kind of looking inwards and wanting to take care of themselves and figuring out, okay, this is a very highly intense, powerful entity that has come in and is taking over. And is it, not that I agree with this at all, but is it better for us to be allied with them to protect ourselves and our own people, or is it better for us to continue fighting them but then get defeated? And so a lot of that division, that internal division amongst Arabs and Arab countries and Arab identity is very deliberate and is very much done by the colonizers. And I think that's something really important to point out. And then just also the violence, like the amount of violence that Israel has used to become what it is and continues to use, right? And that's kind of that myth of being the only democracy in the Middle East. And again, lots of connections to what happened in this country with indigenous and native communities, and also like stealing African people and making them slaves to build the foundations of this country. There's the hypocrisy of now who is deemed violent, right? It's Arabs and Muslims are called terrorists, and Black and brown people in this country are seen as violent. But really the history shows that the colonizers are always the violent ones, and that the only ways that these countries work and are sustained is through violence. And so keeping that in mind and being confident in calling out who uses violence and which violence is, not say which violence is worse, but which violence was unwarranted and which violence is warranted is really important. And when we talk about resistance in general. So to get us into the border, we'll watch this video and then I'll open it up to just any reflections or comments about 67.
This is Sheikh Jarrah. Since Israel occupied East Jerusalem in 1967, Israeli settler organizations have been trying to remove Palestinians from their homes, not just in this neighborhood, but others too. The issue's been subject to decades-long court cases. At the core are two main issues. Settlers claim Jews own the properties, citing Ottoman-era records. And Palestinians argue they were allowed to remain in Sheikh Jarrah through an agreement between Jordan and the United Nations. Lawyers for the Jewish settlers claim that because the land was occupied by Israel in 1967, previous agreements are null and void. Lawyers for the Palestinians counter-argue that previous agreements must stand and that the residents have protected status. Palestinians cannot take Israelis to court for property taken over by the State of Israel. This checkpoint at the entrance of Sheikh Jarrah is new, installed in mid-April. Israelis can pass freely, but Palestinians who don't live in the neighborhood cannot enter. Even with press credentials, we weren't allowed to pass until the police officer was satisfied we were meeting a resident. That resident is Mohammed El Kurd. He's used social media to highlight the forced expulsions of Palestinians from this neighborhood, which he describes as ethnic cleansing. But now he feels, after this latest round of violence, where Hamas cited Sheikh Jarrah as one of the reasons for the war, there is a moment for change.
I think it says a lot about national unity. This is a moment we have not seen in a very long time, particularly since the late 30s. We have not seen the Palestinian people rise up as one body from the river to the sea. And I think it says, it gives me a lot of hope.
Let me show you what it's like when a Jewish settler organization takes over a home in this neighborhood. This belongs to the El Kurd family. Now this is their home. This also used to belong to the El Kurd family up until 2009, when a court awarded it to a Jewish settler organization. And they've been living here ever since. That's the distance that we're talking about. We're not talking about huge spaces, we're talking about a home taken over, part of a home taken over from a Palestinian family. Sami Arshad is one of the lawyers for the families facing forced expulsion. He says that the latest conflict has focused international attention on the neighborhood.
This case reflects many of the hard issues of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There is a community of Palestinian refugees living there, the rights of refugees, the right of return. The conflict over Jerusalem is just reflected in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. The issue of Israeli settlement and the Israeli occupation and the Israeli illegal annexation of East Jerusalem is there. So it's no wonder that this case is now in the scope of international attention.
After confrontations between settlers and Palestinians took place in May, the Israeli Attorney General has gotten involved. That has put any further expulsions on hold until June 8th, when the AG has to reveal his position. This is seen by lawyers and Palestinian residents as a victory and confirmation that it's no longer a simple property dispute, but one that also has implications under international law. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
So I think this video did a great job on tone of explaining the effects of 67, specifically the borders. I want to open up to questions or comments or reflections right now, or Danya, if you want to add any.
I think just the biggest thing is like this, like if we want to get into a little bit of like the significance of Mona and Muhammad al-Kurd, what do you all think is their significance? Like, why was it that this time was different a little bit? You can put it in the chat if you'd like.
We have another video from Mona that made me cry. So maybe
Maybe let's discuss that afterwards.
But I want to point out, I think, maybe I'll kind of answer it to get us start thinking, is that it is, oh, Fidat, go ahead.
I don't know if this is like answering the question, but I was just gonna say, like, for me at least, I feel like it was the first time like seeing like Mona go live on like what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah, like on social media, like just like seeing it like unfolding live, and she was like updating everyone like in real time. Like that was the first time I personally ever like had that experience where like I felt like seeing her live videos and everything, like I felt like I was like actually like there witnessing what like her and her family were going through. So I feel like that was just like groundbreaking, that like they were able to like report everything in real time, and like social media had a really big impact on like raising awareness on what was going on.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I think that's answering part of it, right? Is that they're like they use social media as a platform to like publicly and in a very raw and, like you said, live way show what's actually happening. And I think they kickstarted a lot of the social media awareness that we saw around Palestine in that time period. And I think the reason that they specifically were engaged in this, I mean, they had been doing stuff from way before, but what happened here is that the very beginning of this video, that it's their home was being threatened to be taken away because of permits that were, or agreements that existed pre-67, and Israel trying to claim that because it was pre-67, it does not count, it's not valid. And so again, thinking of like indigeneity, right? These are houses and land and territory that has been passed down from generation to generation for years, hundreds of years, maybe not written, obviously, because Israel didn't exist, right? So not written in terms of Israel's legality. And now Israel coming and getting to use that and say, well, you're not legal, so we get the right to take it away. I think that helps us question and be critical of like who makes what legal. And even if Palestinians did want to go get permits, they're systemically denied permits. And yeah, so Rania, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think just to add on to this, because I don't think that Mona and Muhammad al-Kurd were the first to necessarily post on social media. There were a lot of people that were before then, but I think what got them like the highest acclaim, which is ironic or funny in an ironic way, is Jacob, the video that went viral, because that really is the one that kind of I think skyrocketed their fame, and that's really what got people really paying attention. And if everyone remembers specifically, which I think the next video is going to talk about it, but it was the irony of the whole situation that some guy from Brooklyn was basically saying, I'm going to take this land, and like what Abid was saying, that these they grew up in there, this is their own home. And I was actually watching an interview with Mona, and she was saying that we don't leave the house as a family together. Like we never all leave the house. And I think the only time they did that, they said, was for her graduation. And she's like, and they were counting down the minutes until they can go back home. And it's because they know they're under this like active threat of being, of having their home taken. So I think that's a huge reason why like Jacob's video went viral and beyond viral. And that's when a lot of intention happened. And that's actually when like everything exploded. Kind of like if you want to talk about with Ahid, like it was the same concept. Like she slapped the soldier. That in itself was like, okay. But then the fact that it went viral and so much attention happened, that's when the Israeli government is like, okay, this is a PR issue now. And they, you know, they become even stricter, they become even worse. And just the worst parts of the occupation come out. And then this also helped, I think, skyrocket a lot of other similar things. Like this is also happening in Silwan. This is also happening in a lot of different neighboring different neighborhoods in Jerusalem, where it's that same concept. I think also the idea just that there were two young twins, young kids that were, I think that also caught a lot of attention, or what kept the attention going was that there were two young kids. And I think Muhammad was studying or had studied in America at the time. So there was just a lot happening in terms of them, which is what kept the attention. But it is worth thinking about, like, how did they get to where they got?
Yeah, that's a good point about Muhammad studying here, because he had like the strong English vocabulary to get on the news. And I mean, not that you have to have that to be valid, but that was part of what got him a lot of these more international interviews too. So any other thoughts about
this
or questions about 67? We're going to come back to this and the present day, but just in general before we move on. So these next parts, I'm just gonna, again, take us through certain key moments of history. I wanna make sure we focus on both intifadas and then come into the last round of couple years of resistance that we've been seeing. What I really wanna make sure we do here is destigmatize the word intifada. So when used, and in like American or Western rhetoric, the word intifada is like seen as something scary that you can't say, and it's supposed to mean violent resistance, or et cetera. But what really intifada is Palestinians rising up and resisting, which should not be a loaded word or controversial word, against all of these things that we've seen just happen to them, against ethnic cleansing and displacement in 1948, against extra land being taken away from them in 67, completely being left on their own to have to fend on their own. And so I want to make sure that that's the way that we think of the intifada, and we think of it not as a word that we have to be afraid of or shy away from, but words that we can showcase Palestinian resiliency and resistance through. So I think the main parts of the Intifada and what I really want to make sure we recognize is a lot of rhetoric from Arabs, from non-Arabs, and sometimes from Palestinians themselves is if Palestinians really, cared, they would have stayed. Palestinians didn't fight enough for themselves. Palestinians should have resisted. And parts of why we always talk about the Intifadas and showcase them. And I want to say there's a lot of other resistance and a lot of other historical moments that obviously we can't cover in 2 hours. So I don't want to say these are the only main historical points, and there's a lot of resources to find more of the history, but these are important because to keep highlighting, because it shows that Palestinians resisted in so many ways. As we saw in the video, it lasted for 6 years. It was a complete, their whole lives, schools and other institutions and infrastructures were closed. And so being part of the uprisings was, everyone had a role in it, and everyone was part of it. And it was a very, just a mass movements of Palestinian unity. I think more unity in the last years. We've seen more unity the last years, but I really just want to make sure that we highlight that. And again, these myths of Israel's just superior and Israel's only democracy, Israel has to constantly defend itself. First Intifada came how many years after the Nakba, right? This intense kind of uprising. And so it's it's not Palestinians starting it, it's Palestinians after trying for so many years and feeling that there is no other way, finally standing up for themselves and resisting. And so that rhetoric, again, of who is violent and where violence is allowed and why violence is allowed is really important when we're talking about Palestine and just social justice movements in general. So this video ended with talking about the Oslo Accords. Did anyone you could raise your hand, put in the chat. Has anyone heard of the Oslo Accords before? Or know what they were? Okay, and Olga, Lemia. Okay, okay, cool. So some of you know it. We're gonna watch this video. It's a very quick video. Really what the Oslo Accords were is 1993, a series of agreements between Israel and Palestinians that were signed. This is highly controversial in Palestinian communities and social justice spaces, whether you agree with Oslo, whether you don't, whether we think people, Yasser Arafat should have engaged with this or not. This is the only video I could find that I really like the way it talked about it. I don't want to enforce what the title of the video that they failed. If you think that they weren't and they were great, that's totally fine and valid, and we could talk about that. I want to just put it out there because I know it's a little controversial, but I think we have a discussion about the Oslo Accords and what we think about it in terms of America also coming in as this peacemaker and really getting very heightenedly involved. I would say America started getting involved in 1967, but I think this, in terms of them being a broker of peace, was one intense moment of US getting involved and really starting to see this as a key thing for US foreign policy.
This handshake was the hope of peace between Palestine and Israel. And this is what the map was supposed to look like. But this is the reality. The Oslo Accords that defined the end of the occupation in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were signed in 1993. It was the moment that the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO. The Accords aimed to set up the Palestinian Authority as an interim government. That interim government was supposed to transform into a permanent one after the Palestinian Independent State was established in Gaza in the West Bank by 1999. The two sides were given 5 years to come up with a final agreement that would lead to a two-state solution. But now, years after the due date, Palestinians still don't have a state. To understand why, we first need to dig deeper into the agreement, then understand what has happened since on both sides. The Oslo Accords were signed after several secret meetings were mediated by Norway for over a year. Popularly called Oslo I, they established the Palestinian Legislative Council, which would be democratically elected and meant self-governance for Palestine. They also set parameters for the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of Gaza and the West Bank, which has been under illegal occupation since 1967. Before the entire West Bank was scheduled to go under Palestinian control, the region was divided into these three areas: A, B, and C. Area A, according to the agreement, was meant to be under full Palestinian control. It initially comprised 3% of the region and grew to 18% by 1999. Area B is where Palestine would have civil control and Israel and Palestine would have joint security control. It consisted of around 25% of the region. In 2011, it went down to 21%. Area C would be under full Israeli control except for its Palestinian civilians and form up to 74% of the territory. But this was never implemented. Israel did withdraw from a tiny part of the area but occupied the West Bank after Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. It still continues to build illegal settlements that are against the Geneva Convention while destroying Palestinian villages. The effort put into the Oslo Accords was recognized by the international community. In 1994, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, Israeli Foreign Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In May 1994, the first phase of the Oslo Accords was implemented. Israel and the PA signed the Cairo Agreement, giving Palestinians control over parts of Gaza and Jericho. Then in 1995, a second agreement was finalized in the city of Taba, Egypt. That would give the PA additional territories in the densely populated West Bank. But the Oslo Accords have not even come close to being realized in any meaningful way. First, they were opposed by many Palestinians and Israelis. An ultranationalist Israeli who allegedly opposed the Accords assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. Palestinians criticized the PLO for agreeing to give Israel access to over 71% of the aquifer's water in the West Bank, while Palestinians were granted only 17%. Some also claimed that the agreement curtailed Palestinian economic capacity because it kept Israel in control of the land, water, and borders. Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party won the election in 1996, but from the very beginning, they had been bitterly opposed to the deal with the PLO. Netanyahu has repeatedly denounced the accord as a violation of the historic right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and as a mortal danger to their security. In 2000, Israel and the PA tried to negotiate a permanent agreement at Camp David in the US. The attempt essentially failed. And in the same year, the Palestinian uprising against Israel, known as the Second Intifada, began after Ariel Sharon, along with about 1,000 Israeli forces, entered Al-Aqsa compound, a sacred site to Muslims in Jerusalem's Old City. After everything that happened in the region, in 2015, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas accused Israel of not committing to the Oslo Accords and declared that Palestinians, quote, cannot continue to be bound by these agreements. And still today, a deal which would end the conflict and fulfill what the two sides committed to in the Oslo Accords, a two-state solution and a lasting peace, is still elusive.
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack with the Oslo Accords. Again, you can get as deep into Palestinian politics, specifically the Oslo Accords. I think the main thing if we want to think of these myths that we're talking about and how this history really shows how these myths that Israel has put out are false, is that one of the myths is that Palestinians have never wanted peace. And again, Israel always has to defend itself. But I think the Oslo Accords is proof that even though it was still hurting Palestinians, they signed these agreements. And by hurting, I mean that it wasn't acknowledging, settler colonialism and taking back full ownership of all of the land. It was, we'll try to do with what we have. Let us just have ownership of specific parts of, where they were forced into the West Bank and Gaza, and being able to have political representation, at least in those areas. Even that was not met actually at all, right? And even that was not honored and was not upheld. And so again, this idea of who needs to defend themselves, who brings the violence, who is actually trying for peace and who isn't, is really important with Oslo. Yeah, Reem, go ahead.
I don't know if I missed it, but was there an actual not punishment, but if they were to not go ahead with the agreement, I don't know if there was something written that something would happen to the other side. I don't know if you get my question.
To Israel to hold them accountable. Honestly, I don't know. I would assume not, and that's why they've gotten to. That's a really good point. I've never read for that in detail, but I feel like even if there was, they get away with it, right? Like even like international, if like they get away with violating international law. And I think that's part of the problem and like part of the question I still don't know exact answer to, although we can like guess, is like, why is it that Israel gets to get away with everything that they don't uphold and they don't do?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Abir.
Yeah, thank you. Danya, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think I think Reem, to answer your question, I don't know if there was like a specific, like if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. But the whole idea of the Oslo Accords, to give a little bit more, I guess, context, was it was kind of like a way to end the Intifada, because at the time, like a lot of people were dying because of the first Intifada, and the Oslo Accords is actually exactly what ended the Intifada. So it was kind of like an act of desperation, and I think that's where more of the controversy comes up. Like some people say no matter what, it shouldn't have been signed, and others can kind of see the act of desperation that came from it as a way of ending, the many lives that were lost. But regardless, there was a lot of terms that were drawn that in an ideal world, if both parties followed it, maybe would have seen some kind of semblance of peace. However, that's not the case. And the reality is now is that the Palestinians are still being held up to this Oslo Accords when the Israelis did nothing except reap benefit from it. So like they held up the parts that benefit them, but did not hold up any of the parts that benefit the Palestinians, except establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which for them, and the idea was to kind of create this own identity that can govern themselves, right? But in every other way, they ended up creating and isolating and dividing the West Bank and Gaza and Palestine in general, because of the fact that they created areas A, B, and C. So Reem, if you remember when we were in Palestine this past summer, we were like entering area A, B, and C. That is a direct result of the Oslo Accords, because the idea was basically we're going to create these 3 different entities, and until we find peace, which the goal of the Oslo Accords was basically to end everything and everything would be great in 1998. So the ongoing debate now is basically like, okay, if this wasn't upheld, like this was a 5-year plan for peace. If by 1998 this was not upheld, right, then why is it still in effect at all, right? And that's the question. And I think it's becoming more and more popular where people are completely refuting and calling out the Oslo Accords and saying it's a failure. But it did take time to get to that point for a lot of people. And it's because of that, because it's like this idea of, which again, like as oppressed people were, I think Palestinians are always looking for quote unquote peace. Like they're looking for that peace, but they're always getting the short end of the stick, because I think Oslo Accords is a perfect example of how Israel engages in the peace process and peace talks with no intention of establishing peace. Because if you look at it, like this was a perfect, it was America's involvement. It was very well recorded. Everyone knew it. And Israel did not uphold anything that was, ultimately good for the Palestinians. And it held everything that was good for the Israelis and actually ended up working worse on it. So that is the main controversy around the Oslo Accords. And I think that makes sense. If anyone has been to Palestine, I'm sure you've seen areas A, B, and C. And like right now, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but the deal of the century, whatever is the steal of the century, basically that proposed taking all of Area C and annexing it into Israel. So you can still see the effects of the Oslo Accords till today. Abir, do you want to call on Ines?
No, go ahead.
Ines, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, I have a question. So, I noticed, well, from what I remember back in like the beginning of Hope, that Oslo, isn't that like the capital of like Norway? Or something?
Yeah, this wasn't,
like what,
that's
like,
why it's called Oslo. I want to look it up. I honestly don't know.
but why,
Do you know?
like, is it, or I heard something
It was
like
signed
that.
in the DC, but you're right. I think they
is the
discussed it
capital
and they
of Norway.
came up, because I think if you I'm not too familiar, maybe Brian can jump in with the history part, but what I know is that they spoke about the peace process somewhere and then they actually signed it in DC. So I think they had called the Oslo Accords, which was like a couple of days until they came up with this peace agreement, and I think it did happen in Norway, which is why it's called Oslo. And then they formally signed it in DC.
Wait, but like, why Norway? If you know,
I think it was just a
I'm sorry.
neutral area, because
Yeah.
with a lot of a lot of, whenever you have different countries like negotiating something, they usually like to go like to a neutral area. I don't know. I'm gonna look it up quickly to see. I don't know if Brian, you want to jump in, or Abby? Sorry.
No, I haven't thought of this. This was a great point in us. I'm thinking maybe Norway was like the Sweden of today, right? The neutral area of, or
Because I didn't know if
they're often considered neutral. Thanks, Brian.
oh, because what's it called? I don't know if I should bring like my dad's politics into this.
I was when you raised your hand, I was like, I'm listening. I put it out. So again, I have very specific views on Oslo, and they're a little biased if you can't tell. So I also thank you, Danya, for more of like the perspective. But Ines, yes, of course, if you want to bring that perspective in, please do.
I don't know, because I remember like they were also like him and his group, like they were talking also about like Norway, and then also they were talking about the Oslo Accords too, and they said like from the beginning like they were more biased towards Israel, because like I believe like what President Arafat, I believe he like met with them like in Norway like in secret, I believe. I don't know if my history is horrible, but like met with them in secret, and then in hopes of like having them kind of reach out to like basically giving them a platform, giving Arafat like a platform to talk to whoever wasn't the prime minister of the time, just because of, like the Israeli's prime minister wasn't like, didn't want to talk to them, like didn't want to talk to the Palestinian, the President Arafat basically. I don't know, it was something like that from what I remember.
Yeah,
I was not sure if it's true.
I think the thing is that Ines, it's going back to the idea of there was an active intifada happening, and the first intifada, which we're going to get into, we already got into it, so we talked about it, so you can look into it a little bit more, but the first intifada was very, very deadly, and a lot of different people are trying to get involved to just end the intifada, like end this thing. So I think that's where that came from. Obviously, the West in general is very biased towards Israel, so that I think no matter what is the case. But I think again, the controversy comes not necessarily like it's like again the aftermath. Like a lot of people say, for example, okay, 1998 was how many years ago? Like, you know, like, and I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes today. Like, why are we still upholding parts of the Oslo Accords when clearly parts weren't kept up? So
I think there is a point, and that's, I think the point that you're making those is interesting. Think of like, when is it that Israel starts engaging in peace conversations with Palestinians? And it's when someone else and a Western power has to come in. And I think that that's an important claim that we can make, is that it only wants to talk about it or with Palestinians if someone else is negotiating that or brokering that. And that speaks to how much they dehumanize Palestinians and other them. And they're not important enough unless someone else comes in. So it's an interesting point. Brian, I saw your hand up. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of don't want to be I mean, just, you know, just wanted to add that, you know, in the political circles that I'm in, you know, Oslo is a complete sellout. And, you know, and I think one of the things that, but I do agree that whether or not you believe that, like the since 1998 thing is completely valid. I think one of the things that 67 did and what Oslo did and what A, B, and C and it throws a lot of legalese into this, right? When we're arguing about like international resolutions and Geneva this and Oslo that and Area A, right? Which are all realities, right? But they're narrow arguments that obscure the bigger picture of, you know, settler colonialism as the, you know, sort of original problem in all this. And, you know, it kind of, I bristle sometimes when the word like peace gets used a lot, you know, and I say, well, you know, peace in the absence of justice, you know, what's that worth? Right. And that the violence of resistance is always on trial and never the violence of the system, which we see everywhere, including in the, you know, wretched country that we live in here, US.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I think that's and if you've been to protests and hear the no justice, no peace chant, and it never kind of clicked, that's exactly why. Is that how do you ask us to have peace when there is no justice? And so a lot of these words, same. I don't know how I feel about that word anymore. So a lot of these words hold a lot of meaning that we can critique. Ragida?
I personally always felt that the Oslo Accords was just a way to give Israel more time to take more land. Like it's like a way to make it look like, okay, yeah, we're gonna have peace now, but behind the scenes they're just taking more land.
Yeah, thanks, Ragida. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think I don't want to like keep putting my personal bias or politics, but I would agree also. But I also say that I would not disrespect Palestinians who had to agree with this and were trying to protect their own people. I think that is where these are very deep conversations. I like Rania explained, there was a reason and we get it, and we cannot, it's easy for us to sit here how many years later saying this is what it was, this is what it is or shouldn't have been, and we weren't the people on the ground handling it. So I will respect that, but I do agree that from a political standpoint, political level, everything that was said. I see, Ines, is your hand up again, or is that from last time?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to ask a question, probably maybe like ask an opinion or ask for your opinion. Do you think that's also after like the Oslo Accord, like after all that, do you think that caused even more hatred between these two these two big political parties in Palestine, like the Hamas and Fatah? Do you think that kind of fueled it even more, just because like I believe Fatah is like they're all for it, like they're all for Oslo, and then the Hamas is like all against it? I don't know. I don't know. But do you think like it fueled it even more?
Rania, I'm gonna.
Well, this is gonna get into like a really long one, and maybe we do an event about something separate. But also Hamas, just because a lot of people think that. Okay, so quick summary. So Fatah is basically has been part of the resistance since the beginning. Hamas started in the late 1980s, so they weren't that like they're still baby organization then. And a lot of them were all part of together. I think what I want to say fueled it is not necessarily the Oslo Accords itself, but maybe down the line, like the aftermath when it wasn't actually executed properly. That's definitely what fueled it, because then, you know, Fatah took a lot of the blame for Oslo Accords because Yasser Arafat was the leader of Fatah, while Hamas didn't. So I think it led to that, but that's a good question. I think it definitely led to it eventually. I don't know specifically about the Oslo Accords because, again, at the time, like a lot of people think Hamas has been there since the beginning. It wasn't. It was a movement that was born in, I believe, in 1986. I could be wrong, but I'll look up the exact date. But it was in the late 1980s. And again, this is another fun fact is a lot of people think Fatah has always historically been more of like a peace, which it hasn't. Fatah has the original motive was armed resistance. So it was armed resistance, but then it became slowly, and I think this, if you want to say Oslo Accords was the turning point for Fatah from going from an armed resistance to more of peace talks. And, you know, Brian obviously brought up a lot of very valid points about peace talks, but that's just, I think that was more of the general switch. And that's also when, at that point, Hamas became more, violent resistance, oriented. So that's kind of where the split happened. I'm not like the best aspect, and I think it happened actually more in the later 1990s, so more like in 1998 leading to the second intifada, because I know Hamas really rose up in the second intifada with like the suicide bombings and all of that, and that was more in the second intifada, which I think is why I say like when the Oslo Accords basically didn't pan out, so like after 1998, that's when, you know, there was more of a divide. What I wanted to say as a general disclaimer, and I think this is like, I love that we're having this discussion, and I think that what's important for not only this discussion, but just in general, is that Israel's goal is to divide, right? No matter what, it's always to divide. So there's a lot of different opinions on the Oslo Accords. There's a lot of different opinions about Hamas and Fatah. There's a lot of different opinions about a lot of things. And I think as Palestinian supporters or as Palestinians themselves, I think our goal is to keep in mind the goal, which is Palestine, and not to necessarily antagonize each other to the point where we're so divided, which I've heard. And I think it's absurd where people will say like someone of this opinion is basically equal to an Israeli. And it's like, that should never be said. And I think that's the dangers of having such, such heated debates about this stuff, because people and not knowing how to deal with, we can agree to disagree. But that's just something, an important disclaimer, because I think what's missing from the Palestinian struggle is this idea of unity and the idea of we could completely disagree on all politics. We can completely disagree on the Oslo Accords. We can completely disagree about all all political, everything. We can completely disagree on everything, but the goal is Palestinian liberation. And I think that is very important. Like what Reem said, we're not going to free Palestine until we're united as Palestinians. And what that means is not that we're on the same view. And I think that's what's really important, because people think, oh, united means everyone thinks this. No, united means that we can have differing opinions, but we're going to respect each other no matter what, because the ultimate goal is a free Palestine. And I think that's the important thing to get out of this conversation and any other quote unquote controversial conversation that happens in Palestinian history. Because unfortunately, a lot of times it becomes like a yelling match and a screaming match, and you're a traitor and you're a traitor, and then I'm like, then what's the point? Like, where are we going? Like, who cares, right? Like, we're moving forward right now. Let's focus on liberation. So just putting that out as a disclaimer, and I think that's also why we're trying to be like a little careful about how we navigate this topic, because a lot of times, like the way that these topics are discussed is that one side is completely wrong and the other side is completely right, or the opposite. And I don't think it's beneficial to talk about it that way. That's my personal opinion, but I think that, again, unity is the goal. So just putting that out there.
Thanks, Sonia. And I think it's not just with Palestine. I think with a lot of social justice conversations, I think there are definitely hard no's and limits of where we can engage with people if you can't understand it as settler colonialism and apartheid and, those key things. That's a very important boundaries to have. But I think that the factioning and the polarization of Palestinians is very deliberate, and unfortunately we feed into it a lot. And exactly what Anya said is we don't need to all have the same political view. I actually think there's a lot of good things that come from differing political views. Again, not just for Palestine, but for all social justice movements, that if we could learn how to utilize different liberation tactics, we could get closer to freedom. So thank you all for a really great discussion. I think we want more of these as we go through the classes, and as our guest speakers come, please feel free to ask them about these too. Ines, I'd love to know what your almost lot of things about this also. But I want to move us through, just because of time, that we do have some things to cover. I'm just going to move us through videos for the next 5 to 10 minutes with just transitioning us, not too much discussion, and then I want to save the discussion for the end.
This handshake was the hope of peace between.
So this video already referenced Oslo Accords. The Oslo agreements were not being met up, led to the Second Intifada, which lasted 5 years.
The Second Palestinian Intifada or uprising started late September in 2000, triggered by then Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa. Sharon was accompanied by thousands of soldiers when he declared the Al-Aqsa compound would remain under Israeli control. To Palestinians, this was a provocation, and what ensued was weeks of fighting between Palestinians and the Israeli military. Overall, the Second Intifada was more than 4 years of intense violence, killing at least 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. The conflict prompted Israel to build a separation wall in the West Bank, dubbed by Palestinians as the Apartheid Wall.
So it was a very quick overview of those 5 years, but I think the main difference is the Second Intifada was definitely more violent than the First Intifada, and the separation wall or the Apartheid Wall was a direct outcome of Second Intifada. And there's another video, if we have time, which when we get to focusing on the West Bank specifically, if we have time to show it, or if you haven't watched The Present, which is a short clip on Netflix, that kind of references a lot of the present day realities of the wall and the checkpoints and what's happening in the West Bank. But I'll put it as a resource, this video that explains specifically the separation wall and how it actually, so the myth of the separation wall is that it's to protect Israelis from Palestinians because of this intense violence that came out of the Second Intifada, but really it's built on Palestinian territory. So it's an excuse to expand Israel's territory and take more of Palestine's area or more of Palestine, but it's used under this excuse of, well, look how violent Second Intifada is. We need security, and so that they call it a security wall, but we understand as the apartheid wall. And I'll put that specific video on the Google Classroom just to learn more about it. So after the Second Intifada, obviously there's a lot of history in there, but main thing that comes taking us more into the last couple years, last decade of Palestine, Israel, and the US coming in. In 2017, Trump announces the move, the US embassy move. So Trump announces that he's going to move the American embassy to the eternal capital of Jewish people, Jerusalem. And so moving the US capital to Jerusalem, what mainly the controversy behind it is that what is the word I'm looking for? Legitimizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And Jerusalem obviously is very contentious. It shouldn't be contentious, but it is. It's very important for people of all faiths. That's how it comes into the Palestine-Israel conversation. And so moving it and saying the US Embassy to Israel is going to be in Jerusalem was, again, just stating that we believe that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Palestinians have no right or ownership in Palestine, and that Israel should have, basically the implications very summarized, Israel has control or has full rights over Jerusalem. And so that is part of where a lot of that contention came with the US Embassy move, and why, even if a lot of people are saying it's just a symbolic thing, symbolism is very important, especially in Palestinian history and struggle. And as we see, it's the way that history is rewritten. And so a lot of times, like I see a lot of Israelis or Zionists like claiming Jerusalem as their capital and showing love for Jerusalem. And it's just, it's very frustrating because it's not your capital and it's not yours, and yet they get to claim ownership of it. And it's very hard for Palestinians to get to Jerusalem, especially if you have a Palestinian ID card, you can't get into certain parts. And so there's a lot of control of movement and who has access to spaces, especially in Jerusalem, because of this. And there's a lot that we can research and talk about, but for the sake of time, I just want to move us forward. So we see in 2018, the Great March of Return, which took place in Gaza. I want to take time to talk about this because we don't often talk about Gaza in the context of full Palestine, or if Gaza is talked about, it's always talked about in the context of Hamas. And so I really want to center, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I want to center people in Gaza and the resistance that they have been able to mobilize. And especially in 2018, we saw a really strong and beautiful moment of resistance with the Great March of Return. And I don't know if anyone remembers this or saw it as it was happening, but it was a great moment to follow.
A year ago, Ahmed Abu Rtema sent out a Facebook post from his home in Gaza asking what would happen if hundreds of thousands of Palestinians marched into the buffer zone, fronting the barbed wire and the chain link that fences off Gaza with the de facto border with Israel. A year later, hundreds of thousands are here at the Great March of Return with the aim of breaking the internationally illegal 12-year-long Israeli siege of Gaza and reclaiming their right to return to their ancestral homelands.
هذا حقنا وحق كل فلسطيني، وجايين هنا عشان ندافع عن حقنا وعشان نرجع على البلاد.
بدنا نضل نيجي احنا ونخلي المسيرة مستمرة حتى نحقق أهدافنا.
القدس عاصمة فلسطين سنظل مستمرين إن شاء الله سنظل مستمرين في حراكنا في الإرباك الليل في كل حاجة لما ينفك الحصار عن قطاع غزة كليا.
We're here at the front line at Malaka Camp, the largest center of protest in the Great March of Return in Gaza. Around 50 meters away from me lies the de facto border that separates Israel and Gaza. Now, for clarification purposes, it's basically barbed wire reinforced with concrete slabs and another fence around 2 meters away from it. The Israeli forces are usually situated in those sandpits that you can see diagonally, and behind them are the Israeli army convoys and tanks. course, the Great March has come at a high human cost. The United Nations has stated that 195 Palestinian protesters have been killed by Israeli forces. And there's been more than 29,000 injured over the last year, half of which have been targeted by live ammunition. These injuries usually come towards the knees, creating a generation on crutches here in Gaza.
سألنا أن ينفكوا الحصار عن قطاع غزة ويفتحوا المعابر وبدنا نشغل الشباب. ما لقيتها في عنا شباب ما يقارب 25 سنة و26 و30 وقاعدين على الشوارع أبواب الدار ولا سفر ولا شيء ولا شيء.
فيش حياة، بدنا نعيش مستمرين لآخر نقطة دم. لو إطلاق مدفعنا صوبة 6 مرات.
There's definitely a sense of euphoria here all over the tent as you see young women, children and mothers serving food. We have some delicious strawberries here. Shukran. Tislami. Everyone seems to be very happy, marking the 1-year anniversary of the Great March of Return. The children here dressed in traditional Palestinian clothes keep offering us stuff. There's more than the strawberries, there's mint, there's ba'lewa. This is amazing. I just want to stay in this tent for the rest of the day. To conclude our day here, marking the 1-year anniversary of the Great March of Return and Palestinian Land Day, Ahmed Aburtima was recently asked why so many Palestinians of all ages continue to march unarmed despite the danger. And he replied that the Great March represents a collective scream of invisible and discarded people shouting defiantly, "We are here and we will be heard."
So the second video we'll put again on the Google Classroom, I think just for the sake of time. I won't play it, but just to give a quick context of why opening that border is really important is, if you don't know, Gaza is called an open air prison. And the reason it's often called or termed an open air prison is because Israel has blockades, sea, air, and land military blockade on Gaza. So nothing comes in and nothing goes out without Israel's control. And that's like food, electricity, water, like all aspects of life for Palestinians are controlled by Israel. And so when they're talking about opening the border and wanting to live, it's about literally having some agency of your life and not, your life in all of its aspects being controlled by the oppressor. And it's very sad, but the is that the reason Israel does this is to really just kill out the population in Gaza, right? Is to waiting for them to just not exist anymore so that they can take over that part of the land too. There was a video that I often show that said that Gaza was deemed to be unlivable by 2020, and it's 2023, and Gaza is still there and Palestinians are still there and thriving. And I think that also speaks to the resilience of Palestinians literally in an open air prison, still existing, get bombed every summer, usually every Ramadan, rebuild right away, or as soon as they can, and kind of keep that act of resilience up because they know that the goal is to eliminate them. And so, there's a lot of those stereotypes of like, oh, Palestinians reproduce so much and like, in such small areas, but that is the point, that is in many ways a form of resistance for Palestinians. Rania?
I just want to add one thing, because like Abir said, so Gaza is fully blockaded, and the control of resources, though, is not only limited to Gaza. So that's also all in the West Bank. And I think a lot of times, and this is also an Israeli tactic, where a lot of the humanitarian issues are turned to Gaza. And of course, with the bombings and with the active killing in the sense of like destruction, it is much worse in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, water, electricity, anything is completely controlled by Israel. Israel actually took out all of the resources. Even like, for example, this past summer, we went to Jericho, and there was a stream of water that was the only stream of water that's left in Jericho that that the Israeli settlers are trying to take over. It's only free running water left. And this is what's crazy, because growing up, like, you never saw pools, you never saw any of that in Palestine. So I just thought that's just how it is. And then I found out that all the settlements have pools, all the settlements have always running water, full electricity. So it's a tactic that they do. And the reason why I do this is obviously Gaza deserves its full attention, but also not giving into this Israeli tactic of fully separating, the Gaza from the West Bank. So it's also keep that in mind, like in the back of your head, So a lot of times, like a lot of the humanitarian issues are very much focused on Gaza, and we forget about all the humanitarian issues that are also taking the West Bank, but more like undercover, if that makes sense. But obviously, like I said, Gaza is a huge humanitarian crisis, and it takes its own step, but just keeping that in mind in the back of your head.
Thanks, Sonia. That's an important point. I'm gonna, again, just save questions for the end, but if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat as they come up so you don't forget them. This takes us to 2020 and still continuing today, normalization deals by Arab countries with Israel. I think I personally make some parallels again to the 67 loss of we're just going to look inwards and do what is good for us and what's going to profit our people and our countries. Obviously, we are not generalizing the people in these countries. There's so many Moroccans and Sudanese and Egyptians and Jordanians that 100% support Palestine. We are talking about the governments and the leadership and people in power who aren't listening to their own people sometimes of these countries that are creating deals with Israel. And the reason that we call that normalization deals is if we are creating deals with Israel, then we are legitimizing Israel's existence as a state and as a power in this global world that we live in. And the whole point of the Palestinian struggle is to understand Israel's settler colonial power and to go back to Palestine being for Palestine and for the right of return. But if we have more and more of, quote, our own Arab countries, which I don't think identity even matters anymore in this context, legitimizing Israel and creating deals with it as a country, then we're saying you can stay and you're there and you know, we don't need to give land back to Palestinians. And that's I think for me a really important key point. And I'm sure a lot of us saw a lot of these normalization deal announcements as they were coming up, and we can continue to unpack that too. So 2020 takes us into 2021. So this is what many people refer to as the Unity Intifada. I don't think it is technically termed an intifada. It's not technically called the third intifada or anything, but I think for some Palestinian organizing spaces and for Palestinians, the amount of people that participated, and the reason it's called Unity Intifada specifically is we saw, like we talked about before, we saw people from all parts of Palestine coming together in the same moment for the same collective cause. Usually, again, part of Israel's occupation is this deliberate separation of Gaza or the West Bank or people within the 48 area or what is called Israel. But this was the first time we saw people from all three really working together. And for me, it was a kind of powerful reminder of the power of unity and mobilization of the masses. And so I want to show, this is going to be a little bit longer. And this is the one with Munal-Qud, which is always really hard to, I don't know why that's
Brendan.
It's really hard to stop watching it, but you can watch the rest of the video on Google Classroom if you want to watch it.
We're on the grounds of Al-Aqsa. It's one of the holiest places in the Islamic religion. And so we've come here today on one of the holiest nights of Ramadan. The crowds are huge. So if any...
I also want to note that some of the beginning of this might be a bit graphic for people. I'm sorry, I should have said that from the beginning. So if you want to look away, it's like the first, I think, 2 minutes or so. Please do so if you need to.
If anything happens, it could potentially be very dangerous for the people that are here. It's nighttime prayers for Palestinian Muslims. And this year, Israeli forces showed up unannounced. So you can see that there is Israeli police actually inside, in the grounds of Al-Aqsa. That's what triggered the protests, and that's what triggered the anger today. Palestinians feel like they're being pushed out of East Jerusalem, the city they see as the capital of a future Palestinian state. They say Israel is upping its efforts to redraw the borders of the city, but Israel claims it belongs to them, despite the United Nations saying it's an occupation, illegal under international law. The Israeli police have been arresting loads of Palestinian children. Palestinians are retaliating because
This mistake is costing Amazon Prime shoppers big. Are you still using Prime? Because at this point, it's the dinosaur of online shopping. What if I told you there's a new exciting alternative? I'm gonna show you one simple trick that
Young men have been taken away by police.
عالم ما لهاش جايه توصل باب الله تغشوهم خروا مسكوا سخكوا كلكم تسووا اللي بدكم اياه تعسيه ما بلا خايا يا زلمه
قديش عمرك؟ قديش عمرك؟ قديش عمرك؟ 15 سنه ايش سويت؟ ليش اخذوك؟ ليش تفكرون اخذوه؟ ليش؟ على مود شنو؟ بدهم يقعدوا الشباب، بدهم يقعدوا كل الشباب واحد واحد.
As Ramadan continued, Palestinians in East Jerusalem faced stun grenades, arrests, and water cannons, some of the worst violence seen in years.
هدول رشوا علينا مي طالعين فيش شيء فينا ولا شيء كلاب حيوانات شو بدك كبير
عادي ولا شيء عادي حبيبي عادي
عيش بس هذا ما تنساها اوعك تنسى هذا ايش نسوي.
East Jerusalem is important to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. It's also the site of the sacred Jewish Temple Mount. But most of the people who live in this part of the city are Palestinians. That's been slowly changing since Israel captured the area in 1967 and started moving in settlers. Jewish people now make up around 40% of the population. And in 2018, Israel was emboldened by President Trump, who moved the US embassy into East Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. It outraged Palestinians, but was celebrated by right-wing Israelis.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
At the heart of the fight over East Jerusalem is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, home mostly to Palestinian families, some who came here in 1956 after being displaced by Israel when the state was created 8 years earlier. Israel claims Jews historically owned this land. Now, there's a lawsuit to forcibly evict some Palestinian residents, making its way through the courts. Protesters have been turning up since the issue reached the Supreme Court this year.
بسنة 67 أول بيت استولت عليه الجماعات الصهيونية بعد الحرب ب5 أشهر شهر 11 67 استولوا على أول بيت بالحي وهو بيت عائلة الشنطي.
Mona al-Kurd and her relatives are one of 28 families fighting in court to keep their homes.
صدقوني ما حد من أهل الحارة رح يطلع إلا لآخر لحظة يجي يشحطونا شحط لنعيش بيتنا أرضنا.
Other Palestinians have already been replaced by right-wing Israeli settlers.
Hey! Hey! رجاء بدناش
ايش صار هسه؟ ايش صار؟
كانوا واقفين شباب وصبايا فلسطينيين وهجم عليهم نزلهم بالعصاي. شوف العصاي اللي بايده سراقين هدول سراقين حرامية. أنا وياهم بنفس البيت.
هم ببيتك؟
هم ببيتي. تعي شوفي. هذا البيت اللي أخذته ستي لأنها لاجئة تهجرت بال48 من حيفا. هذا البيت بابا بناه بسنة 2000 لأنه تزوج وجابنا فصار بده مساحة أكبر. بس بابا أنهى بناء البيت وعمرنا ما سكناه. أجا القاضي سكر باب البيت ورجع على المحكمة وأمر إنه البيت يضله مسكر بحجة إنه مبني بدون ترخيص.
منو يعيش بيها؟
مستوطن شباب مش عيلة.
انتوا تعيشون هنا
وهم هون
وهم يعيشون
بالضبط
هنا.
بابا وماما كانوا يشتغلوا حوشوا مصاري وبنوا هذا البيت.
اوكي
كله من تعبنا وشقانا. وبعدين أصدرت محكمة الاحتلال قرار بإنه يجوز للمستوطنين السكن في المنزل. طب ما هذا البيت بدون ترخيص صح وعليه أمرين هدم. طب هو بدون ترخيص على أي أساس بتسكنوا مستوطن إسرائيلي فيه وبتمنعوني أنا كفلسطينية أسكن فيه؟ على أي أساس؟ أني ديمقراطية هاي؟
ايش تشعرين لما تشوفي؟
قهر انزعاج يعني مزعج متعب. أنا ما ببكي لأني ضعيفة أبدا، صدقيني والله، بس ببكي لأنه نتعاملش مع دولة عادلة، احتلال، وهذه أرضنا. أنا انخلقت ربيت وعيت كبرت هون، على أساس في يجي حدا ياخدها؟ كيف؟ بأي منطق؟ اللي عم بيصير مناهض للقوانين الدولية. تهجير القسري جريمة حرب.
I'm gonna pause it there. I think this is a great video to watch all of it. That part always gets me very emotional. The next part right after actually interviews the settlers that are living there, I think, and I just don't want to watch that right now. And we don't have time, but I will put it on the Google Classroom for everyone else to watch it. I'm gonna just pause for reflections, comments, emotions. And again, a lot of what she said is those direct ties, so I'll stop sharing for a second, from 67 into now, and these permits and legality and who's allowed to be in spaces. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, kind of goes into what we were talking about with like the Oslo, about how like they're allowed to like not go through with what they agreed to. So kind of like this, how she was saying like how come they're allowed to live here without a permit, and then me as a Palestinian, I'm not like allowed to be there.
Yeah, exactly. You think, yeah, it's like all the hypocrisy, and it's like under democracy, it's supposed to be fair laws for everyone, and they claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East, and they're the ones that differentiate with people the most. So
yeah,
thanks.
Fidat has her hand raised.
Yeah, there you go. Fidat, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I don't know, I just feel like in no other way would that be allowed, like, anywhere else. But for some reason, when it's happening to Palestinians, like, everyone's okay. Not everyone's okay with it, but like nothing's being done. And it's just crazy to think that people are actually like being kicked out of their homes, and like their homes are just being stolen from them, and nobody's doing anything. Everybody's like justifying it. That was like really frustrating to like watch.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I think like, why is it that this country of all countries is always held above just international law, like not even morals, just like actual laws? And I think that speaks to so much of like white supremacy and America's power and Western power. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Brian?
Yeah, I think, you know, videos like that, and, you know, things like what we're getting from Yasafar Mata and other places, you know, it really brings it down to a very granular level of like a street, a neighborhood, a building, you know, and that's very tangible and real. It's not a political map or a zone A or a, right, you know, and like that AJ Plus video that from, I guess, a year or so ago or whatever, you know, with the guy from what is it, Keep Jerusalem, you know, they have an office there in Totowa. It just, you know, it makes it more real for people, I think, you know, and can bring it and make tangible what is abstract, you know. I don't mean to be like, I think sometimes what it can also do though is make the worst of what the Zionists do the conversation and not Zionism, right? Like we must show videos like this, right? And then for me personally say yes, and 48 too, right? Like I think I think some folks, liberal Zionists among them, everybody would be okay if we just went back to 67 borders and then, let's just shut up. And, I think, sort of a both end, talking about both is important. And I'll just end with this when we think about like, well, why does it happen and why is it justified? I think we have to look at history, right? And like there's patterns with what goes on here, with what happened to Native Americans, indigenous people in North America, with what happened with the US and Jim Crow, with what happened with South Africa and apartheid, and nobody wants to talk about this, what happened with Nazis and the Jews, right? Who they learned from Jim Crow laws how to make laws like the Nuremberg laws, right? Like it's all, it's all tied together. And I think one of the reasons it stands out now is because it's post World War II, and supposedly we're not supposed to be able to invade and occupy each other now, international law. And then on top of that, as far as why is it like not get called out and why does it get propped up? I mean, we're sitting in the reason why it gets propped up, right? Our country, if we didn't support the Zionist state, it wouldn't exist. It would crumble without our. We prop it up, right? And that's fundamentally one of the many reasons why I'm involved in liberation work, is like when they take money out of my paycheck, it's buying the bullets, right? So I owe it to work against it.
Thanks, Brian. I echo all that you said, and I want to highlight the important distinction that you made of, and in case anyone isn't familiar, is that there are, especially liberal Zionists and some people who are pro-Palestine, that will say, as long as we go back to 67 borders and people within the West Bank, for example, like Muna's family, gets the permit to their house and settlers don't take their house, we're okay. And they're only against the settlements of within the West Bank or extra settlements, or what's happening in Gaza. They won't go as far as to say, well, let's go back to 1948. It was all Palestine. And I think, and that's a very important distinction to make. And that's something that I think when we bring it, not next week, but the week after, when we bring in some Jewish allies and people who work on the right of return, we can talk about, we can ask him to talk a little bit more about that difference. And that's actually a good point. I didn't think of it as like, when you show videos like this, it makes it less abstract and more tangible. Like this is someone's actual home and you see the person and you see the house. And same thing with thinking of American tax dollars. It's not just something that's far away that we have no role in. We do have a role in. So it's very important. Any other thoughts about this? So we have 2 more videos I wanted to show. This was supposed to be the last slide, and then over the weekend I added one more. So last year, we saw a lot of great resistance come, especially in December, a lot of youth-led resistance. Obviously things triggered the resistance, so I want to just make sure we have time for that, and then we'll go into what happened a couple of days ago.
Thank you for joining us. Fighting has erupted in the occupied West Bank after Israeli forces launched an operation against a Palestinian armed group called the Lion's Den. The occupation forces entered the old town of Nablus on Monday night, sparking protests. At least 4 people have been killed in Nablus and 1 near Ramallah. Another 21 have been injured. There have been power cuts in parts of the city. Demonstrations have also been reported in Ramallah. Nida Ibrahim has more from Ramallah.
It's important to point out that the Lion's Den has had a lot of support by Palestinians lately. We've seen Palestinians praising them. Those groups of people have posed a challenge to Israel, not only because they are young men who say that Israel only understands the language of force, sometimes going inside Israel, or to confrontation points and carrying out shooting attacks against Israel. but also because they are cross-factional. They're from different Palestinian factions. They are mobilized in a way that was hard for Israel to penetrate. And we've seen an increase in the Israeli measures to try and track down the Lion's Den. The city of Nablus has been under siege for more than 2 weeks. So we know that the tension is high. We are approaching the Israeli elections. This is a time when many Palestinian analysts would tell you Israel would try to show that it has an iron fist, that it's trying to win more votes by appealing to the right-wing voters in Israel and by showing that they are cracking down on any military activities by the Palestinians.
So what do we know about the Palestinian group, the Lion's Den? Well, members of the armed group first appeared in public in Nablus in the occupied West Bank last month. They recited what they called a charter of resistance during a memorial service for 2 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Since then, the Lion's Den has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on military checkpoints and illegal settlements in Nablus. Ibrahim Yunus is a media coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement. He says the Lion's Den armed group emerged from an urgent need to protect the occupied territories.
To understand the perspective of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, you have to look at a situation where there's 800,000 settlers who are illegally occupying a great percentage of the land there. You have constant daily attacks on Palestinian youth who are, whether they're crossing checkpoints, whether they're walking to school or to work. The number of young Palestinians run over by cars or attacked by settlers is large. So obviously there's going to be a lot of popularity among youth in the West Bank when a group says that they're not going to accept the presence of these settlers on their land. They emerged out of a group of youth who defend the city, essentially, from Israeli incursions, and decided to create a more formal group that would defend the city, which is where the group name and organizational structure sort of emerged. They do not have a working relationship with the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority at the higher levels collaborates with or coordinates security with Israel, and the Lion's Den does not. So they do not have a formal relationship.
So I think the important context here is that, especially in the last couple of years, we see this heightened audacity from Israeli settlers and civilians to come in and take over and say, this is mine, and to claim it. And what we're seeing is the youth specifically organizing themselves away from any political faction, or, you know, we could talk about the PA all we want. That's another long conversation. Again, a very grassroots activist youth-led movement. And there's, you know, you can have the internal of violence versus not violence and resistance. I think for me, it's always we live here and our role here is different from their role there. And our goal and our role is to support Palestinians in whatever way that their resistance is needed and the way that they need to at that time. And I think there was a lot of inspiration, at least personally, that I saw from Palestinian youth self-organizing and mobilizing and really being the face of resistance against Israeli settlements. So that happened late last year, around December. Unfortunately, it's not even this last day of January, and I think already almost, if not more, 30 Palestinians have been killed just in 2023. And very specifically over the weekend, if any of you followed or saw, there was a massacre in a Jenin refugee camp where I think it's the latest number was 10 people were killed, over 20 injured. And we'll just watch this, hopefully there's this video of it, and we'll kind of open it up and end with questions or conversations about what took place over the weekend, and then some of the retaliation and the way that the news started covering what happened over the weekend only after Israel was attacked and Palestinians actually reacted to what happened in the refugee camp. So I think what was interesting is the U.S. I think they called it like their counter-terrorist raid, and so it was the way that like even they were not going to call it a massacre, and even with like full proof that Israel came in disguised as a commercial truck and massacred and killed and injured people, we're still going to find some type of justification for it. And in case you didn't see what happened after, is Palestinians did fight back, rightfully so, in Jerusalem. I think, I don't know the exact number, 8 to 10 Israelis were killed. Please correct me if that was wrong. And then all of a sudden we see it on American media and news, right? And I think that was really important. And it's like, of course, this is the only time that was 7. Thank you, Nanya. That was the only time that that it was talked about. And if that retaliation, and if Israelis did not get affected, then that massacre would have just, again, been swept under the rug and not talked about. And something Nanya mentions, that even internally, even with like internally in our community, not everyone was really talking about it, maybe because the number was small, but what we have to do is really always talk about these as they're happening. And I just want to add that even when they did start talking about it in Western media or American media, even though it was centered around Israeli civilians or Israelis dying, it was still called, it was still not called like, well, this happened, and so Palestinians were Italian, this happened. We just talk about it as Palestinians are attacking Israelis without any context of like, well, what caused them to do that? What happened to them first for them to retaliate? And I think something else I noticed was the first article I saw about it said that it happened at a synagogue. And then I was reading other things that said that that actually was not true. And this kind of all ties into this weaponization of anti-Semitism, where if we're going to say it happened at a synagogue, then it's so easy for everyone to be like, oh my God, that's so, wrong, which obviously it is, and anti-Semitism is wrong, but to falsify that or to say that, I think it was near a synagogue, we're not actually directed at it, just to kind of continue conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which we're definitely going to get to next week. So those are my thoughts about everything that happened. I'm just going to open up the next 6 minutes to thoughts about what happened over the weekend or just in general. I know that there's been a lot. Yeah, just feel free to unmute and start sharing. Yeah, no, the things. The New York Times mentioned the shooting in Jerusalem, didn't bother to mention massacre in Jenin. How can we show people that Palestinian lives matter as much as everyone else's? That's a great question. Maybe that's the question that we end on. Is what are ways that we can start doing that? Or you can just share general comments and reflections if that question is a lot right now too. Yeah, for that, go ahead.
Reem, I really like that question. It's very loaded. I don't know an answer to it, to be honest. I think about it all the time. It's sad that we even have to like prove that our lives matter, but that's unfortunately like the reality. But I think like the best way that I can try to make sure that happens is just by like making people aware of what's going on, whether that's like sharing information or like showing them or teaching them about classes like this, or like showing them what's going on. I think like just raising awareness about what's going on is like a good way to start, at least to like wake people up and open their eyes to see what's going on over there. Cause like, it's crazy to think that a lot of people don't even know what's going on over there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and that's, I want to take more control over the media and not wait for the media to share stories and share our own. And I know that's something that we've been thinking about at PAC too. Brian?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. I think from my perspective, as someone who has who has privilege to leverage, right? Who doesn't have to sit there and say, okay, I'm a woman, right? I'm a Palestinian woman. Right? What will how will what I say be taken? What will I be accused of? Right? Like no one's gonna call me a terrorist, right? You know what I mean? I've been called a lot of other things, but no one's gonna call me. So I think for me personally, I just have the obligation to like never stop talking about it. You know, I like some things are symbolic and surface, but they matter, right? Like language matters, right? Like using words like settler colonialism, not calling it a conflict, right? And as a history teacher, you know, telling people, you know, would like it's 2023. Do you blame Sitting Bull and Black Kettle and Chief Joseph for, you know, like what they did? When you read it in the books that we read, you know, about raids on settlers, quote unquote, in history by people indigenous to North America, do you think it's justified? Do you think enslavement rebellions were justified, including violent ones? And we can easily say yes to that because we have the distance of history. Well, guess what? You're watching it now. When someone carries out an operation on a settlement, they're doing what Sitting Bull did. And if he's not a villain, neither are they, you know? And I think it's important to frame things like that and use things like, you know, IOF instead of IDF. I know it can be like surface and symbolic, but like it matters, you know? And when people hear and see me say it that way, or, you know, unabashedly, you know, wear like, you know, the t-shirt, or like my winter hat has a kaffieh pattern on it, you know, or whatever, right? Like I'm putting it out there and I'm loud and proud about it. And that's one thing that I have to do because I'm able to do it, right? I can't speak for anybody else, but that's just where I'm coming from.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think the links to co-strugglers are really important. And I think this, again, I actually think it's better for us to just focus on ourselves first, right? It's hard, it's easier to tell other people what to do and not think of our own identities, our own privileges, where those weigh in and weigh out. And not just for Palestine, but for all other struggles that need our support and need to be uplifted too. So thank you, Brian, for that. Yeah, I think there's one more thing I was gonna say, I forgot. Danya?
Yeah, just on the topic of privilege, because I think that's very important. Even as Palestinian Americans, like we have the privilege of our American identity. And I think that's really, we emphasize this a lot at PAC, that whenever we talk to our, you know, our Palestinian brothers and sisters on the ground, their thing that they keep saying is use your American identity, you know, use it. Use the power of talking to Congress, use the power of protest, use the power of free speech, use it, right? So I think it's a lot of us to sit with, you know, we are here, we're here for a reason, right? And understanding what our role in the struggle is and how we can utilize our privileges to help the struggle in the long run and help all oppressed people. So I think it's always kind of recognizing where you are at a point of privilege. And just a quick anecdote, like I remember even when I go to Palestine, like I remember talking to some of my family, like we need to organize, we need to, and then I had to sit with myself and realize that I'm coming from a lot of American privilege where I can do that here, and it's not threatening my life, it's not threatening my existence, it's not threatening you know, my family, my kids, you know, it's not. While there, it very much is, right? So Palestinians don't always have that privilege, and they have to make that very conscious choice. Like even with the video that we saw, like a lot of these are young people that, you know, some of them are young fathers, some of them were due to you know, married soon, and all of that, they gave all of that up, you know, and they were killed. So to that specific group, but there's, you know, all the martyrs are from all different kinds of life. So it's realizing that privilege too, that we're in America for a reason, and utilizing it and basically talking about it all the time and utilizing all your avenues to continue talking about it, because that is the way of liberation. And that is what our Palestinian brothers and sisters want.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. It is 9:30.